The first time the HOA came after my father, he laughed. Not because it was funny, because after 22 years in the U.S. Army, after deployments overseas, after sleeping in desert storms and surviving mortar fire, he couldn't believe the biggest threat to his peace was a woman named Cheryl holding a clipboard in a gated subdivision outside San Antonio. My dad, Walter Hayes, was 63 years old, retired Army mechanic, Bronze Star recipient, quiet man, the kind of guy who folded grocery bags neatly and still woke up at 5 a.m. every morning without an alarm. He didn't bother anybody, didn't throw loud parties, didn't blast music, didn't leave trash out. The only thing that stood out about him was a truck, a restored olive green military cargo truck parked beside the driveway, an old M35A2 decommissioned Army transport vehicle he'd spent 6 years rebuilding with his own hands. To most people, it looked like an oversized military relic. But to Dad, that truck was history, memory, brotherhood, healing. Every scratch on that steel carried a story. And every Veterans Day, local soldiers from the nearby base would stop by just to take pictures with it. Kids loved it. Veterans respected it. The HOA hated it, especially Cheryl Whitmore, HOA president. Perfect blonde hair, fake smile, the kind of woman who weaponized neighborhood rules like federal law. 3 weeks after Dad moved into Cedar Ridge Estates, Cheryl knocked on our door carrying a violation notice. I still remember her voice. "Oh, wow," she said while staring at the truck like it was radioactive. "That thing absolutely cannot stay here." Dad opened the screen door calmly. "Morning to you, too." She ignored that. Our community guidelines prohibit commercial vehicles, oversized vehicles, and visually disruptive structures. Dad blinked. "It's not commercial. It looks military." "It is military." "That's exactly the problem." Dad crossed his arms. "This truck served this country longer than most politicians." Cheryl forced a laugh. "Well, this isn't a base, sir. This is a private neighborhood." I was standing behind Dad in the hallway watching his jaw tighten. Most people mistook his silence for weakness. Big mistake. Dad looked at the paper. "You got a problem with veterans." Her smile vanished instantly. "Do not twist my words." "Then don't twist my truck." For a second, I thought she might explode right there on the porch. Instead, she straightened the blazer and pointed her pen toward the driveway. "You have 72 hours to remove it." Then she walked away. Dad shut the door slowly. "You keeping it?" I asked. He smiled. "Son, the Army couldn't make me abandon that truck. Cheryl from the HOA sure as hell won't. That should have been the end of it. But people like Cheryl can't handle losing." Over the next month, the harassment escalated. Violation notices, daily inspections, anonymous complaints, letters taped to the mailbox. One morning, somebody even zip-tied a fake parking citation to the windshield. Dad never reacted publicly, but I noticed a change. The old man started sitting outside in a lawn chair beside the truck every evening, like he was guarding it. One afternoon, I found him wiping dust off the hood carefully with an old army rag. "You okay?" I asked. He shrugged. "Funny thing about serving your country. People salute you overseas." He paused, then complain about you when you park at home. That hit hard, because it was true. The neighborhood loved pretending they supported veterans. Flags on porches, patriotic Facebook posts, discounts on Memorial Day. But when an actual veteran moved in with something real, something imperfect and authentic, suddenly they wanted it hidden. 2 days later, Cheryl held an emergency HOA meeting. Apparently, Dad's truck had become a threat to property values. I went with him. Big mistake. The clubhouse was packed. Half the neighborhood came just to watch the drama. Cheryl stood at the front with a projector screen showing pictures of Dad's truck from different angles like it was evidence in a criminal trial. "This vehicle," she announced dramatically, "creates an aggressive atmosphere inconsistent with community standards." Dad raised his hand. "You talking about the truck or Congress?" A few people laughed. Cheryl didn't. She clicked another slide. "Our bylaws clearly prohibit military-style vehicles visible from the street." Dad stood slowly. "No, they don't." She froze. Dad pulled a folded HOA handbook from his jacket. "Army habit. Always carry documentation. He flipped pages calmly. Section 8.2 prohibits commercial transport vehicles over 26 feet. He looked up. My truck is 22. Murmurs spread across the room. Cheryl's face tightened. She recovered fast. Well, it still negatively impacts aesthetics. Dad nodded. So does your inflatable Christmas reindeer, but nobody called the cops. The room burst into laughter. Cheryl slammed her folder shut. This is not a joke. Dad leaned forward. No, harassing a veteran over a legal vehicle isn't a joke. That should have embarrassed her into backing down. Instead, it made things personal. 3 nights later, around 2:15 a.m., my phone rang. Dad's voice sounded different. Tight. Controlled. Son, he said quietly, they took it. I sat straight up in bed. Took what? The truck. I drove to his house in under 10 minutes. The driveway was empty. Dad stood there in jeans and boots staring at the oil marks where the truck had been parked, like somebody had stolen part of his life. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Nobody came outside. I clenched my fists. Who did it? Dad handed me a folded notice. Authorized HOA tow enforcement. Requested by Cheryl Whitmore. I felt rage hit instantly. They towed a military vehicle. Dad nodded once. Then he pointed toward the street. A security camera across the road blinked red. I think they forgot something, he said calmly. That's when I realized something important. Dad wasn't defeated. He was patient. And patience is dangerous when taught by the Army. The next morning, we visited the tow yard. The manager met us outside looking nervous the second he saw Dad. You Walter Hayes. Dad nodded. The man swallowed hard. So, we didn't know. Dad's expression stayed neutral. Didn't know what? The manager lowered his voice. That truck belongs to a registered military preservation program. Dad stared at him silently. The guy continued nervously. About an hour after we impounded it. He pointed toward the office. We got a phone call from Fort Sam Houston. My stomach dropped. Dad said nothing. The manager looked terrified now. And then another call. From who? I asked. The man swallowed again. The Department of Defense. Dad slowly removed his sunglasses. And for the first time since this whole thing began, he smiled. The tow yard manager's hands were shaking. Not a little nervous shaking. Real fear. The kind of fear people get when they realize they accidentally stepped into something far bigger than neighborhood politics. Dad stood there calmly beside me, one hand resting on his cane, staring at the impound office like he'd seen this kind of panic before. And honestly, he probably had. The manager wiped sweat from his forehead. Sir, if we'd known the vehicle was tied to a military historical registry, we never would have touched it. Dad tilted his head slightly. You still hooked chains to it. The man looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. HOA paperwork looked official. Dad gave a dry laugh. Son, anybody with a printer can look official. Inside the fence yard sat Dad's truck, his pride and joy. Only now the front bumper was scratched, one side mirror hung crooked, and muddy tire marks covered the door. The second Dad saw the damage, his entire expression changed. Still calm, but cold, Army cold. The kind that makes everyone nearby instantly quieter. He walked toward the truck slowly, running his fingers across the dented metal. Then he stopped at the hood. There, barely visible beneath the dust, was a faded insignia of his old logistics unit. A unit he lost friends in. A unit he rebuilt this truck to honor. Dad closed his eyes for 2 seconds. That was it. Just 2 seconds. But I knew him well enough to understand. Cheryl had crossed a line she didn't even know existed. The tow yard manager cleared his throat nervously. Sir, Fort Sam requested photos immediately after the tow. Dad looked up. Why? The man hesitated. Apparently your truck appears in official military community events. I blinked. What? Dad sighed quietly. I volunteer for veteran ceremonies sometimes. You never told me that. You never asked. That was my father. The man could casually reveal he worked with military organizations like he was talking about grocery shopping. The manager hurried into the office and came back with paperwork. There's more. Dad scanned the document silently. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly. Interesting. Very interesting. What? I asked. Dad handed me the paper. At the bottom was a line highlighted in yellow. Special Transport Vehicle. Federal Historical Exhibition Registration. I looked up at him. You registered it federally. Dad shrugged. Years ago. The manager spoke quickly. The Army-based legal office says towing the vehicle without verification may violate federal transport protection guidelines. My jaw dropped. Wait, the HOA illegally seized federally registered property. The manager nodded weakly. And they're asking who authorized the tow. Dad folded the paper carefully. Cheryl Whitmore. The man winced immediately, like hearing her name alone caused pain. Then we heard screeching tires outside. A white Mercedes SUV flew into the tow yard parking lot. And right on cue, Cheryl stormed out. Perfect makeup. Designer sunglasses. Pure rage. There you are, she snapped. She marched toward the office holding a stack of papers. I've been calling nonstop. Why hasn't that disgusting truck been crushed yet? The entire tow yard went silent. Dad slowly turned toward her. You trying to break a speed record, Cheryl. She ignored him completely. Then she noticed the truck still sitting intact. What is this? She barked at the manager. You were paid to remove it. The manager looked ready to faint. There's been a complication. No, Cheryl snapped. The complication is that man refuses to follow HOA rules. Dad crossed his arms. Funny thing about rules. She glared at him. The Army has bigger ones. That stopped her for half a second. Then she laughed loudly. Oh, please. You think being a veteran puts you above regulations. Dad's face hardened instantly. No, but federal law usually does. The manager quickly handed Cheryl a printed notice. She skimmed it casually at first. Then her expression changed. Then changed again. Then completely fell apart. What is this? The manager swallowed. Fort Sam Houston Legal Division requested immediate release of the vehicle. Cheryl scoffed. This is ridiculous. It gets worse, the manager whispered. She looked up sharply. What now? The man pointed toward the office television. Local news. A reporter stood outside Cedar Ridge Estates. The headline across the screen read, Retired Veterans Historic Military Vehicle Towed by HOA Sparks Legal Questions. Cheryl's face went pale. Dad looked at me. You call the news? I shook my head. You? Nope. The tow yard manager raised his hand carefully. Actually, someone from the base media office contacted them. Now Cheryl looked genuinely scared. Not angry. Scared. Because people like Cheryl survive on control. And once public attention shows up, control disappears fast. She tried recovering immediately. This is being blown out of proportion. Dad stared at her quietly. You had my truck towed at 2 a.m. It violated policy. Dad pointed toward the damage. So did that. She crossed her arms defensively. You can file a claim. Dad smiled slightly. Oh, I plan to. Then another vehicle pulled into the lot. Black government SUV. No markings. 2 men stepped out wearing polos with military insignias. Not active combat uniforms, but official enough to change the entire atmosphere. One carried a folder. The other scanned the truck carefully. They approached Dad first. Mr. Hayes. Dad nodded. The older man extended his hand immediately. Thomas Reed, civilian liaison for Fort Sam Houston. Dad shook it. The younger official looked furious the second he saw the damage. Who authorized the tow? Nobody answered. Cheryl suddenly found the sky very interesting. Mr. Reed opened the folder calmly. Mr. Hayes, your vehicle is listed as a historical military preservation transport under federal exhibition support. Cheryl interrupted instantly. It's parked in a private HOA. Reed turned toward her slowly. And she blinked. Our association has authority over neighborhood compliance. Reed gave the smallest smile imaginable. Not over federally registered historical equipment. Her confidence cracked visibly. Dad stayed silent. That silence was destroying her more than yelling ever could. The younger official photographed the truck damage carefully. "This mirror assembly is original military issue," he muttered. Dad nodded. "Hard to replace." The official looked annoyed. "Very hard." Then Reed asked a question that changed everything. "Who ordered forced removal without federal verification?" The tow manager pointed directly at Cheryl. No hesitation. No mercy. Cheryl's mouth opened immediately. "I acted with an HOA authority." Reed cut her off. "Did you contact the registration office listed on the vehicle documentation?" Silence. "Did you verify ownership classification?" More silence. "Did you notify local authorities regarding federally documented transport?" She folded her arms tighter. "We didn't think." "Correct." Reed interrupted coldly. "You didn't." Dad looked at me sideways. That tiny looks at everything. Game over. But Cheryl still didn't understand. People like her never do. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. "You're all acting like this is some kind of military emergency," she snapped. The younger official stepped closer. You interfered with federally registered historical property tied to veteran outreach programs." She rolled her eyes. "It's an old truck." The official's voice sharpened instantly. "It transported wounded soldiers overseas." Silence hit the yard like a bomb. Even I didn't know that. I turned slowly toward Dad. He avoided eye contact. That told me the story was painful. Very painful. Reed softened his tone slightly. "Mr. Hayes restored this vehicle personally after retirement. It appears in veteran memorial events across Texas." Cheryl's confidence finally began collapsing. The news cameras arriving outside the tow yard didn't help either. She spotted them through the gate. "Oh my God!" Too late. A reporter hurried toward the entrance. "Mr. Hayes, is it true the HOA removed a federally registered military vehicle?" Cheryl panicked instantly. "This is harassment." Dad chuckled quietly. "No." He adjusted his cap slowly. "This is consequences." The reporter pointed toward the damaged truck. "Sir, how do you feel seeing this?" Dad paused a long moment before answering. Then he said the one sentence that would explode across social media by nightfall. "I spent my life serving this country." He looked directly into the camera. By that evening, the story was everywhere, not just local news. National veteran pages, military Facebook groups, YouTube reaction channels, TikTok clips. HOA tows retired Army veteran's historic truck. Veteran humiliated by HOA president. Military official step in after HOA seizes registered vehicle. Millions of views in less than 24 hours. And at the center of it all was one 63-year-old retired mechanic who still drank coffee from a chipped Army mug and had absolutely no idea how viral the internet had made him. Dad hated attention, but attention had found him anyway. I walked into his kitchen the next morning and found him eating toast while his ancient flip phone buzzed nonstop on the table. "You know your face is all over TikTok, right?" I said. Dad frowned. "What's a TikTok?" "That's probably for the best." He took another bite calmly. Meanwhile outside, absolute chaos. News vans lined the street outside Cedar Ridge Estates. Neighbors suddenly acted very different. The same people who ignored Dad for weeks were now waving awkwardly from their driveways. One guy even walked over carrying a six-pack and said, "Thank you for your service," like he hadn't signed the original HOA complaint himself. Funny how public shame changes people. Dad remained polite, but distant. He'd seen fake loyalty before. Around noon, a black pickup pulled into the driveway. Then another. Veterans. Within an hour, our quiet neighborhood looked like a military reunion. Retired Marines, Army mechanics, A-Force veterans. Even two Navy guys somehow showed up despite Dad constantly joking they got lost on the way to the ocean. One by one, they came to support him. Some brought food. Some brought tools. Some just stood beside the damaged truck silently. That silence meant more than speeches ever could. A gray-bearded veteran named Curtis ran his hand over the dented mirror and shook his head slowly. "Damn shame," he muttered. Dad nodded once. Curtis looked toward the HOA entrance. "So when we marching?" Dad laughed for the first time in days. "No marching." Curtis grinned. "Fine. but I brought bail money just in case. By afternoon, American flags appeared all over the neighborhood, not because people suddenly became patriotic, because they were terrified of looking anti-veteran online. And then came the reviews. Oh Lord, the reviews. Cedar Ridge HOA's public page got obliterated. Hundreds of angry comments flooded in. Harassing veterans. Disgusting abuse of power. Hope you enjoy federal court. Imagine towing Army property and thinking you're smart. The HOA tried deleting comments. That made things worse. Screenshots spread instantly. Then somebody leaked footage from the emergency HOA meeting, specifically the part where Cheryl called the truck aggressive. That clip exploded online. Veterans reacted with fury. One former Army officer stitched a video and said, "That aggressive truck probably did more for America than Cheryl ever will." 5 million views. Overnight. And Cheryl? She completely lost control. At 7:30 p.m., she came storming up Dad's driveway again. No smile this time. No fake professionalism. Just panic-wrapped in designer clothing. I opened the door before she could knock. "You need to leave. I need to speak with your father." "You mean the veteran you had robbed?" Her jaw tightened. The situation has escalated unnecessarily. Dad appeared behind me calmly. "Evening, Cheryl." She immediately switched tones. "Softer now. Careful. Walter, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." Dad nearly laughed. "You towed the foot." She ignored the comment. "The board is willing to discuss a peaceful resolution." Dad folded his arms. "You mean before or after the Army called?" Her face flushed red. "This media circus is damaging the neighborhood." Dad looked around slowly. "Funny." He pointed toward the crowd of veterans gathered beside the truck. "Looks more like improving it." A few veterans laughed loudly. Cheryl forced a tight smile. "What exactly do you want?" Dad stared at her, and for a second, I thought he might finally explode. But he didn't, because calm people are dangerous, especially veterans. "I want you," he said quietly, "to stop treating military families like garbage." Her expression hardened instantly. "We enforce rules equally." Dad pointed toward a massive RV parked 3 houses away. No violation notice there. Then toward a neighbor's boat. None there either. Then toward a commercial landscaping trailer. Still nothing. Cheryl's voice sharpened. "That's different." Dad stepped forward slowly. "No." He looked her dead in the eyes. "You thought an old veteran would stay quiet." Silence. The veterans behind him stood motionless now, watching. Cheryl looked suddenly uncomfortable. Dad continued. "You saw a widower living alone and assumed nobody would defend him." That hit harder than yelling ever could, because it was true. Mom passed away 6 years earlier. Since then, Dad mostly kept to himself. Quiet house. Quiet life. Cheryl thought isolation meant weakness. Big mistake. Dad pointed toward the crowd. "Turns out," he said softly, "the military remembers its own." Cheryl looked around nervously as more vehicles arrived outside the subdivision. Motorcycles, pickup trucks, flags. Veterans kept showing up. Word had spread fast. One biker wearing a Vietnam veteran vest shouted from across the lawn, "Hey, Walter, you need us to park tanks on the golf course." Dad burst out laughing. Even I laughed. Cheryl didn't. She looked horrified. Then her phone rang. She answered immediately. "Yes." Pause. "What do you mean resign?" Longer pause. Her face lost color instantly. "No, absolutely not." Another pause. Then she looked directly at Dad. "Fear. Pure fear. The sponsors are pulling out." Now the veterans got interested. Apparently, Cedar Ridge Estates had a massive annual community festival funded by local businesses. And thanks to Cheryl becoming the face of anti-veteran arrogance, sponsors were abandoning ship. Fast. She ended the call shakily. Dad spoke calmly. "Bad news." She glared at him. "You've turned the public against us." Dad shook his head slowly. "No." He looked at the damaged truck. "You did that yourself." Then another vehicle arrived. This one mattered. White government sedan. Legal division. The moment Cheryl saw the seal on the door, she stopped breathing normally. Two officials stepped out carrying folders. One approached Dad politely. "Mr. Hayes." Dad nodded. The man handed him documents. "We completed preliminary review." Dad scanned the first page. Then he looked up at me and smiled. That smile terrified Cheryl more than anything else so far. "What is it?" I asked. Dad handed me the paper. My eyes widened instantly. Potential federal liability, property interference, unauthorized seizure, civil damages. The HOA wasn't just in trouble anymore. They were exposed. Badly. The second official turned toward Cheryl. "Will also require all internal HOA communications regarding this vehicle." Cheryl blinked rapidly. "Why?" "Because a selective enforcement occurred." He closed the folder calmly. "The liability increases significantly." That's when her confidence truly died, because selective enforcement was exactly what happened. Everyone knew it. The RVs, the boats, the trailers, the commercial vans. None got touched. Only Dad's truck. Because Cheryl didn't hate rule violations. She hated being challenged. And now, that ego was about to cost her everything. As the officials walked away, Curtis the veteran leaned toward Dad and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "So," he grinned. The following Monday, Cedar Ridge Estates held the most crowded HOA meeting in its history. Not because people suddenly cared about landscaping rules. Because everyone wanted to watch Cheryl burn. The parking lot overflowed. News vans lined the street again. Veterans stood outside holding American flags. And inside the clubhouse, pure panic. Board members whispered nervously at the front table while Cheryl shuffled papers with trembling hands. For the first time since this nightmare started, she looked small. Dad sat quietly beside me wearing his old army jacket. Nothing fancy. No medals. No dramatic speech prepared. Just calm. That calmness drove Cheryl insane. Because people like her survive by intimidating others. And Dad simply refused to be intimidated. The meeting began with forced professionalism. "Order," Cheryl announced weakly into the microphone. Nobody listened. Residents immediately started shouting. "You lied to us. You told everyone the truck was illegal. Are we getting sued because of you?" One older homeowner stood up angrily. "My grandson's in the Marines. You embarrassed this entire neighborhood." Applause exploded across the room. Cheryl slammed the gavel repeatedly. "Please remain civil." Then the back doors opened, and the room went dead silent. 3 legal representatives entered carrying folders. One from the HOA Insurance Company, one from Fort Sam Houston Civilian Legal Office, and one private attorney representing my father. I leaned toward Dad. "You hired a lawyer." Dad shrugged. "Army buddy, son." Of course, the insurance representative spoke first, and immediately dropped a bomb. "Due to potential federal liability exposure," he announced, "the HOA's insurance provider may deny coverage for this incident." The room erupted. One board member nearly choked. "Deny coverage?" The man nodded calmly. If selective enforcement and an authorized seizure are proven, individual board members could face personal liability. Every head in the room slowly turned toward Cheryl. Her face turned ghost white. That was the moment everyone realized something horrifying. The HOA might not protect them, meaning Cheryl's decisions could financially destroy the board personally. A bold board member immediately pushed his chair away from her like she carried a contagious disease. "I objected to the tow," he blurted out instantly. Another board member pointed across the table. "She pushed for it." "You voted yes to." Cheryl snapped. "Because you said legal approved it." "I said it should be legal." The room descended into chaos. Board members turned on each other like starving wolves. Dad quietly sipped coffee from a thermos, watching, patiently. Then the private attorney stood. Tall guy, sharpsuit, former military himself judging by the posture. He placed a thick binder on the table. "This binder," he announced, "contains evidence of selective HOA enforcement over the last 4 years." Dead silence. He opened the binder. Photos filled every page. RVs, trailers, commercial trucks, boats, construction equipment, all allowed without penalties. Then came the final page. Dad's military truck, highlighted in red. The attorney looked directly at the board. My client was targeted disproportionately within 3 weeks of moving in. One resident stood slowly. Because as a veteran. The attorney answered carefully. We are currently investigating motive. That sentence detonated like a grenade. Cheryl stood up instantly. That's outrageous. The attorney calmly slid another paper across the table. Email records. Printed. Highlighted. And there it was. An internal HOA email sent by Cheryl herself. This military-style vehicle attracts the wrong type of attention to the community. The room exploded. People started yelling openly now. You said what? Are you insane? My son served overseas. Another homeowner shouted. You made us nationally famous for this. Cheryl panicked. You're twisting my words. Dad finally stood up. The room quieted immediately, not because he shouted, because he didn't. That quiet strength commanded attention naturally. Dad looked around slowly at the residents. I didn't ask for special treatment, he said calmly. I asked to be left alone. Silence. He continued. I bought that truck after losing friends overseas. Now the room became completely still. No phones moving. No whispering. Nothing. Dad rarely talked about the war. Almost never. But now he looked directly at the crowd. That truck carried wounded soldiers. His voice stayed steady. I restored it because I didn't want people forgotten. Several veterans in the audience lowered their heads quietly. Dad pointed toward Cheryl gently. She saw an eyesore. Then he placed a hand over his chest. I saw memory. A woman near the front started crying softly. Even some board members looked ashamed now. But Cheryl, still trying to survive. This has become emotional manipulation, she snapped desperately. Bad move. Very bad move. The entire room turned on her instantly. A Marine veteran stood so fast his chair fell backward. Manipulation, he barked. That man served his country. Others joined in. You owe him an apology. You embarrass veterans nationwide. You abuse your authority. The insurance representative raised his hand carefully. There's another matter. The room quieted again. He adjusted his glasses. Due to widespread media exposure, multiple homeowners have filed claims against the HOA for reputational property damage. My jaw dropped. What? Apparently home values in Cedar Ridge had started dipping online because the subdivision became known nationwide as the anti-veteran HOA. Irony is beautiful sometimes. The same people obsessed with property values had now damaged them themselves. Several homeowners began openly arguing with Cheryl. One elderly man shouted, My house has been listed for 2 months and buyers keep bringing up the damn truck story. Another woman added, My daughter saw us trending on Facebook. We look horrible. Cheryl looked completely overwhelmed now, sweating, shaking, cornered. Then came the final blow. Fort Sam Houston's legal representative stood calmly, after reviewing available evidence. He paused. The Army base has suspended all future community partnerships with Cedar Ridge Estates. Gasps filled the room. That annual Military Appreciation Festival? Gone. Veteran charity events? Gone. Base-sponsored community programs? Gone. All because Cheryl wanted control over a parking spot. Dad quietly sat back down. Still calm. Still composed. That composure crushed Cheryl more than revenge ever could. Then the HOA vice president slowly stood up. And without even looking at Cheryl, he removed his board badge. I resign. Another followed immediately. So do I. Then another. Within 60 seconds, half the HOA board quit publicly. The crowd erupted into shouting again. Cheryl looked completely stunned, abandoned. Finally, she turned toward Dad. For the first time since this began, her voice sounded genuinely weak. What do you want from me? Dad stared at her a long moment, then answered softly, Nothing. She blinked. What? Dad stood one final time. I already won. And honestly, he had, because this was never about money, or lawsuits, or internet fame. It was about dignity. And Cheryl had tried to take that from the wrong man. As Dad walked toward the exit, Veterans outside saluted him one by one. Not dramatic movie salutes. Real ones. Respectful ones. And Dad returned every single salute quietly. Then, just before leaving the clubhouse, he stopped beside Cheryl. The room fell silent again. Dad looked at her calmly and said, "You spent weeks trying to tow away a piece of military history." He adjusted his jacket. "But the only thing getting removed from this neighborhood," he glanced toward the board table, "is you." 3 days later, Cheryl officially resigned as HOA president. 2 weeks later, multiple civil lawsuits were filed. And 1 month later, Dad parked a fully restored truck back in his driveway, this time surrounded by American flags placed there by neighbors themselves. Every Veterans Day after that, families brought their kids to take pictures beside it. And Cheryl? Last I heard, she moved out quietly before the lawsuits finished. Nobody stopped her. Nobody thanked her. Nobody cared. But my father, the old Army mechanic she underestimated, he became something else entirely. A symbol, not because he fought back loudly, but because he stood his ground calmly. And sometimes,